Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Vision Committee meeting for November the 20th, 2024. And this evening, we're going to have a presentation from Mr. Rick Harmon. In the meantime, would you call the roll?
Councilmember Dennehy?
Here.
Councilmember Maloney?
Here.
Councilmember Schmischer?
Here.
Councilmember Stein?
Here.
Councilmember Tracy?
Here.
Councilmember Worthington?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Hamrick?
Here.
Mayor Troutman?
Here. So we have Andrea and Amy. Will you have yellow hands come up so I can tell when you're ready to ask questions? Is that
Yep. I got you.
gotcha? Okay.
I got
If not, just speak up.
Okay.
Because sometimes I don't see the little hand at the top of the screen.
And it is harder when it's in presentation mode.
There'll be, oh, it's in presentation mode. Okay. So, welcome, Mr. Harmon.
Thank you.
Your
Thank you,
official
Mr.
title
Mayor.
is Economic Development Business Coordinator, et cetera, et cetera. What is your official title for the city?
Economic
council?
Development Manager.
Manager.
Yes.
Oh,
Thank
my
you.
goodness. Is
Yes,
that,
manager.
and you have a guest with you tonight.
I do. I have Andy Arnold from Pioneer Development Company, who is our consultant on this project.
Welcome. So, proceed.
Thank you. I will. This conversation has been a while coming. We contracted with Pioneer Development last year, toward the end of last year. Ryan and I, and other property owners have had several conversations with real estate developers, residential real estate developers over the last 4 years. And one interaction in particular was with Fading West that purchased property in town, and they are selling that property in town for a couple of different reasons. One is they had an opportunity to change their business model. But the other is that when they were analyzing our community, evaluating whether their project would pencil, they complained that they couldn't find the right data. They couldn't find data to justify that their project would pencil. They also ended up doing projects in like Breckenridge and rural resort communities that were partially funded by the state. So they came across a different business model basically that helps them out a little bit better. But we've talked to other developers as well that look into our community and do traditional searches like how many building permits are you issuing a year? What are your demographics like? What's your income level like? And that sort of thing. So we struggled. We struggled finding a developer. We even lost out on a low-income housing development project this year, not because of anything other than they weren't awarded the tax credits. So we struggled coming up with a way to entice developers to come to our community. So Ryan and I talked about how do we do this, and we toyed with, and we know Andy from the urban renewal side of things, Downtown Colorado Inc. He consults with them a lot. We met him, struck up a good relationship with him, but we had a number of conversations with him about conceptual conversations. Like, our problem is economic needs assessments, housing needs assessments just don't give us the boost we need to get a developer into our community. However, we need an economic needs assessment for CHAFO or the Division of Housing in order to qualify for any funding from them. So we had this quandary. Economic needs assessment won't do it. How do we do it? So we knew that there was discussion about latent demand, hidden demand in our community. We talked to realtors that said a large majority of their clients were coming from Colorado Springs, unable to find houses. We talked to, even back when I was on the Rec Center initiative, employers who lost employees or potential employees because they couldn't find housing. So we knew that there was a potential latent demand. So we crafted this project to be, instead of just an economic needs assessment of housing, let's take a look at demographically, employer-wise, what actually is missing out there? What is the demand that we can identify through traditional means? And that's what this report is all about. Andy was awarded the contract after, and this was back in October of last year, after I think we got 4 or 5 estimates. I don't remember how many. His estimate came in the lowest, and he quite honestly understood his proposal was much more understanding of what we were looking for. So we handed it over to him. We got a report from him earlier this year, you've had quite the busy General Government and Vision Committee docket this year, so it's taken quite a while to get here. But I will introduce to you Andy Arnold from Pioneer Development Company, and he will go through his presentation and cover the highlights in quite detail of this report. So hand it over to you.
All right, let's check that out. Hello, everyone. My name is Andy Arnold. Rick, thank you for that explanation, because that really is what we tried to do with this report. This is a very unorthodox report because Canyon City, and I would say even Fremont County, finds itself in an unusual position where this is a great place to live, and yet we're not seeing a lot of growth, despite the fact that even in your comprehensive plan and when you have interviews with staff, developers, stakeholders, everybody says, well, we want to see this place grow. Now, we might disagree on what that growth looks like, but at the end of the day, almost across the board, everyone from major employers to staff to developers are all saying, yeah, I think there's great opportunity here. And the purpose of this report is really to identify those opportunities and put together a growth strategy. I'll just start going through these slides real fast. It is a long report. When we first came out with this, Ryan and Rick and I were like, all right, we're going to go find those missing housing units and put it together and just declare it and hopefully have a very concise memo. And what you're going to find is that it is very, very difficult to quantify what that demand really is that's not showing up. And it's a chicken or the egg problem, because if you look at your historic data, and I'll get into this, it's not painting a great picture. If you look at the state demographers' projections of growth and things like that. And as Rick mentioned, I work, well, I'll get into my company in a second, but hang on.
Oh,
We'll figure that out. I work in a field that's all about public-private partnerships. I work with municipal clients, I work with public clients. We,
let's try it again. It worked. So.
okay, there we go. And really what we're focused on is making development happen, specifically development projects. Now, this is a little higher level, this analysis, but just to give you a very quick background on me, I founded my company in 2022. I used to work with an engineering company called SEH. I was in charge of economic development for the western region of this national engineering company. I decided to go out on my own because there's this need for making projects happen in Colorado, and I live in Durango, Colorado, and one of the things that we really care about is workforce housing and development, similar problems that you might have here in Canyon City. Since that time, we're working now actively with 25 municipalities. We also work with a lot of larger developers, trying to figure out ways of bringing in urban renewal, metro districts, public financing strategies to make their developments happen. We also work as a partner with what is called Kansas State University Technical Assistance to Brownfields program. It's basically, it's housed in Kansas State University, but it's the EPA's Brownfield Technical Assistance Program. I'm one of their partners as a real estate economist with them, and we work nationally with communities that may have a brownfield property that they're trying to redevelop. So that's just a little bit of our backstory, and as you can tell, it's not perfectly aligned with, let's say housing studies, but the purpose of this housing study is really to generate development that you're not seeing right now in Canyon City. And that is honestly how I named my company, Pioneer. I didn't go to DU, and I'm not trying to be nostalgic about the West with Pioneer Development Company. It's actually a term. A pioneering development is a development that comes in and it's the first to realize the market potential of an area. The example I always use is Castle Rock. If you've ever been to Castle Rock and you look at the Riverwalk in Castle Rock, before that development happened, everyone said you couldn't build Riverwalk. And then Riverwalk happened, and now all of a sudden it's exploded. And so that's an example of that catalytic development that I really think your city is looking for right now. And so that's what we're trying to find in this report. So our topics and goals, first we're going to talk about growing pains. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but we might as well go through it. And then we're going to talk about developing a strategy, what I just said. How do we catalyze residential growth in Canyon City? What does that really look like? What are the specific residential development projects that might snowball the full continuum of housing development that you need? We're going to talk about your demographics and your economic outlook. There's some interesting findings when Rick and I really dove into the data that I think highlight an opportunity, even though currently it's a weakness, and we could address that with the housing market and housing residential development. We're going to talk about your existing housing market and how it's compared to the region. And then finally, we're going to talk about activating latent demand. We did try our best to quantify what latent demand would be. We talked to all of your major employers. We did surveys with them. I reviewed the literature from EPS back in 2018 that did a very regional housing study and looked at different factors in terms of housing development and what people are looking for. And we tried to get a sense as to what would that annual absorption be if we realized that latent demand here in Canyon City. And as Rick mentioned, the reason why that number is so important is because if you have a higher projected annual absorption of housing units, it's that much easier to draw in a developer. It's that much easier to justify lending. And so we'll talk about that in a second. I put this down and oh, there we go. All right, so first, growing pains. Reading your comprehensive plan, which is fantastic, by the way, I think this community has clearly outlined in its adopted plans a desire for growth. I mean, it's one of your objectives. You want compact, sustainable growth. You're talking about growing neighborhoods, putting this growth within your annexation boundaries or just on the outskirts of the city limits and aligning it with infrastructure development. It's really well thought out, but make no mistake, the city isn't actively trying to stop growth. Would not call you guys NIMBYs or anything like that. And from I said I live in Durango. I love coming to Canyon City. Why not move to Canyon City? I don't think that there's anything holding back. You have all of the amenities in the world. You've got, for a person that loves the great outdoors, you have your rafting, your mountain biking, your backpacking. I mean, it's beautiful. Driving through US 50 coming into town with the sun setting, it's stunning. You have schools that are growing, and you have an ability to raise your kids in a great small town atmosphere. I have 2 young kids, and living in a small town is great. I think it's the best thing in the world. And your downtown is fantastic. Hotel St. Cloud, right, Rick?
There's a joke behind that.
So in any case, what I'm saying is that unlike some cities that may be growing, I think from an amenity standpoint, Canyon City has a stacked deck. You've got all the cards that you would need to play with, and you have a lot more than some other small towns throughout Colorado. So there isn't an obvious reason why people aren't moving here, and that's why I think it's so frustrating. You've put together your adopted plans. You've made a statement that you want to grow in a responsible kind of way. You've clearly invested in your amenities and your quality of life, and yet there's this frustrating pace of development. There's a shared desire to grow, but that frustration over that lack of growth, and like I said, we've done a number of surveys, talked to developers, including developers such as individuals trying to build out large-scale development like 4 Mile Ranch, and everybody thinks the growth's here, but it's just frustrating. How do we get the ball moving? And then I will say from a data standpoint, and you can't see the bottom, this might be a problem with all of my charts. We'll try to get through this with the closed captioning. But the frustrating pace of development, this top chart shows Fremont County's census building permits every single year, going back to 1990 to today. Now, this is a very common pattern because from 2008 to 2012, you have the Great Recession. Almost every community in America, big stop on development. But since that time, excuse me, Fremont County hasn't been able to pick up the pace of development. And what you can't see at the bottom here, let's see if I got that, is that these bars are Fremont County, and they're annual building permits. At the bottom are Canyon Cities. And what you can see is that Fremont County, even though that's a very slow recovery in terms of development pace, Canyon Cities is almost flatlined. Oh, thank you, for whoever's doing that.
Nice job.
Excuse me. And so if you see these blue bars right here, this is your city's annual building permits, residential building permits, 2010 to 2022. And while there's a slight uptick, it's not nearly what it was, what it is relative to the unincorporated county. And the unincorporated county hasn't even recovered from its previous building boom through the 90s and the early 2000s. So that so basically, the anecdotes that we're hearing from developers, staff, everyone's frustrated about the pace of development. It's being spelled out in the census data as well. Okay. Developing a growth strategy. So first, what do we mean by latent demand? Latent demand is defined as a demand for a product or a service that a consumer cannot satisfy because, and there's three definitions that it's given for latent demand. The first is that a consumer cannot afford the product or service. I'll get into in a minute that I don't think latent demand is because housing is not affordable. I want to be careful about how I phrase this because every community in Colorado has an affordability crisis with housing right now. But what we're talking about is a growth strategy, not a housing need, right? And so what I mean by that is Fremont County is, and you'll see in a second, there's a gap in terms of your housing stock relative to what is in demand regionally, and that gap isn't necessarily an affordability question. The other two things about latent demand are really what this was all about. The product or service is not available, or the consumer does not know that the product or service is available. I think that more is in line with this missing market that we're seeing right now in Canyon City. So latent demand is, I see it as a gap in the market currently, and this gap exists between desirability and availability. And so we're just going to get right to the conclusion and then unpack it through this. Basically, this is a chart based upon our analysis that shows what Canyon City's annual housing unit demand could be if you factor in latent demand. And what that means is that it's 99 units. If you go right here, we think that after you factor in latent demand and you factor in all of these different things where we adjust for what I think are wrong projections from the state demographer's office, it could be as many as 100 building permits a year. That's a significant change. And sorry for making this continue to move around. But last year, this was 34 units for Canyon City. So what we're talking about is that if we can find a way to capitalize on latent demand, we can more than double our annual housing permits. We can increase that demand for housing in Canyon City, which will have a dramatic effect on attracting developers and lenders.
Incidentally, when we were considering applying for the Prop 123 program with the state, they have requirements, a certain level of units that we are supposed to commit to every year, and that was about 70-some units of affordable housing in their mind. That's the first time, we were kind of shocked when we heard that because we only issued 20, 30 plus, building permits a year, so we didn't know where that came from. So I don't know where they got that, but this supports even more than that, and this is not necessarily affordable. This is just housing in general.
And it's the full spectrum. It could be single-family homes, townhomes, multifamily units. The idea is that there is demand out there, and like Rick just said, doing 20 to 30 building permits a year is not going to attract investment in the housing market. So we came up with two key strategies. These aren't going to knock your socks off, but I do think it's going to. What I'm hoping is that this report provides you with the talking points and the data to argue what might be an unpopular opinion. And so the first is to incentivize development of market rate or higher end single family homes. We'll get into why that is in a second. And then the second is to incentivize market rate apartments or multifamily development. There's a significant gap in your multifamily market here, a significant gap in rentals. And what you'll see is that those two development types are causing an outmigration for a certain cohort in your population, and the other one is potentially holding back growing industries in Fremont County and Canyon City. Again, sorry, water would be great, actually. Sorry, I drove 5 hours to get here, and I think I forgot to hydrate. So anyway, affordable housing, like I said before, it's a necessity. I'm not trying to diminish it. I'm not trying to say it's not important, and when you are looking like I said, I work very closely with the Durango City Council. We care deeply about affordable housing, but affordability is on a spectrum, and a lot of it can be handled through supply. Thanks, Rick. So first, just to give you an idea of what this report looked at very quickly, in red, you'll see Canyon City's limits. The blue is Fremont County. My goodness.
Boy, I can totally relate to that.
I apologize.
Let us know if you need a cough drop. I could dig one out.
I'm just hoping that I'm not catching what my young ones had. All right, so in any case, balancing a local and regional market. Basically, just so you know, this analysis looked at not just the city, but also the county, and the reason for that is data is mostly held at the county level, so we wanted to combine it. Where it was appropriate, we looked at municipal data. Where we couldn't find municipal data, we looked at Fremont County's data. And then, also to get a sense of the overall market, we looked at your regional communities. So specifically, we looked at Chaffey County, Pueblo County, El Paso County, and Teller. All right, so demographic analysis, identifying the root causes of your growth. First of all, just understanding your relationship to Fremont County. Canyon City represents about 38% of the household population within Fremont County. It was very interesting that 38% kind of held true across the board in terms of number of building permits issued, households throughout Fremont County, and it's a good indicator that if the county grows a certain amount, about 38% of that growth could be absorbed by Canyon City. And so what we looked at is, first, we don't have this high housing demand, but what is the growth? And if you look at this bottom chart here, from 2018 to 2022, these are your average population growth percentages. We've got unincorporated area, greater Canyon City area, and the Canyon City area. And it's higher than Colorado and the United States averages over the last 5 years. So you can't say that this place isn't growing, right? Even though it's marginally higher. But what we wanted to understand is, if it is growing, where are the sources of that growth? Where can you double down on that growth? This, again, is a chart of your population, Fremont County's population from 2009 to 2022. And what we found in terms of root causes of growth, and this was probably one of the biggest takeaways in the report, is that net migration is the reason Fremont County, and by default Canyon City, are growing. It's not natural increase. I apologize for my voice. It is not because of natural increase. Natural increase is the rate of births versus the rate of deaths. The net would be the difference. You basically, if you have 10 births in a certain year and you have 12 deaths in the same year, it would be a natural increase of -2. And so what we find is that the local population is actually negative each year in Fremont County. And what's overcoming that negative growth are people are moving here, right? And so it's interesting to think about because, okay, one, it means that you need to attract more families so that there's more babies. That would be increasing the natural increase. But also, all of your growth that we're seeing that's higher than the state and the national average is because people are relocating here. And so that is a target demographic for residential housing development. You have to think about, we need to keep that going if we're going to continue to show growth as a county and as a city. And what's interesting is that, and this is hard to read, so I'm going to walk you through it. If you compare that to the region, Fremont County is the outlier in both regards. These hard lines right here, the filled-in lines, brown represents your net migration, blue represents natural increase, and those are for the regions. Right here, this is Fremont County's net migration since 2010. And then down here is Fremont County's natural increase. And what this means is that, on average, Fremont County has a more negative natural increase than the surrounding counties and is more dependent on net migration. So from a demographic standpoint, again, just to highlight, what does that mean? It means that you are more dependent on people moving to Fremont County to generate growth. So in a way, if you're trying to position your housing stock, it needs to have an eye on that region to try to attract people into Fremont County. Then we looked at the age cohorts. So this down at the bottom is every different cohort based upon the census. You have 0 years to 4 years old, all the way to 100 to 104. And blue is Canyon City, or brown would be Fremont County. And what I want you to notice is what I've circled here in red. Between 40 and 59 years old, that age cohort dips down. Whereas in most counties, this would almost be like a natural curve, you know, a bell curve. And so that was really interesting because this age cohort, and we isolated it, we looked at net migration by age cohort, that's this cohort again. So what you see in the red here, if we look at migration numbers, in terms of people moving in, people moving out, from 40 to 59 years old, a lot of people leave Fremont County. And that has an impact on what you can build and in terms of just your overall socioeconomic level here. If we compare it to the region, Fremont County, Colorado, Chaffee, El Paso, Pueblo, Teller, again, Fremont County is the only one that's showing a negative net migration. And so what that means is, like, even for the region, it's an odd thing to see, where you are showing a negative increase between 40, 44, 45, 49, 50, and 54. And while that's important, is this age bracket represents your highest percentage of married couples, 64% of the national population. This is the age bracket most likely to have school-age children. It's the highest area median income bracket, and we're losing this age group to out-migration. And specifically, when we look at the out-migration numbers, these people are moving to El Paso County, Pueblo County, Weld County, Denver County, Adams County. And if you think about that, all of these places, if you look at the average home price, it's higher than Fremont County. And so that is one of the demographic indicators. I think it threw up a red flag when we were doing our analysis that you're losing your high earners. These are people that are in the prime time, or this is their prime earning years of their life, and they're moving to places that have more expensive housing stock. And so the idea would be, well, maybe Fremont County doesn't have that housing stock that these people are looking for now that they have grown families. And when we looked at the surveys with major employers, talking to the hospital, looking at previous studies done, that was something that reoccurred over and over again. That Fremont County, and by default, Canyon City, didn't have the type of housing that those people were looking for. Maybe there wasn't enough of it, right, or it wasn't available. And so there's this interesting single-family detached development component to this that might be triggering this out-migration in that group. So then we looked at the economic analysis. We wanted to see where, again, are wages growing? Is employment growing? And if so, what's the source of that growth? Are you helping me out, Rye? I promise I won't be chewing on the mic. I apologize. This is bizarre. So first, wage growth. These are your the average wage, you can't see it, but in 2022 was about $51,000 for Fremont County. Back in 2010, it was $35,000. So what that means is your wages are going up. And it's one thing to say wages go up. I mean, obviously there's an inflation factor. We're very aware of that. But if we compare inflation, which is in this line in the brown, to Fremont County's average wage increases, except for 2022, wages have outpaced inflation. So that's a good sign. Again, the county was growing population-wise, and we're seeing wages go up as well.
You said that, excuse me, let me ask a question there. The
Yes, sir.
annual inflation, that's the annual inflation rate, is that correct?
Yes.
Not cumulative inflation. Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying. And so what we looked at is we looked at specific industry sectors and average percent wage increase from 2018 to 2022, because we wanted to know what are the industries that people are making money in, or they're seeing their wages increase the fastest. And what was interesting about it is that, you know, you've got some very high increases in wages in these various industry sectors. One of the largest ones, though, was professional sciences and technological services. This is not the largest job count that you would have in the county, but it's significant. And what's, again, interesting is that this is a growing There are growing wages in this sector. It is a growing sector for Fremont County, and it has one of the highest wages of all of these other sectors that have been growing quite a bit.
Yeah, it's not a question for you, Andy, but a comment for council. You know, this kind of goes back to what FEDC is doing with TechStart and the initiative to drive this type of profession and entrepreneurship and driving that tech sector. So, you know, kind of anecdotal or I guess actual numbers showing that initiative is being successful here.
And some of that too, when we got the latest census data, I and Brad Rowland and Diana Armstrong and Rob Brown, we all got on a call with the state to figure out what this number meant, because there were 300 software jobs that didn't exist before and 300 project management jobs that didn't exist before in our community. And that was like the telling point that this is working, you know, and it's showing up here as well. This is actually working.
And what this means for housing is you look at that average wage. My goodness. I've never been one not to be able to talk, Rick.
Oh, I've been there. I have been there.
You look at that average wage, and that average wage can afford higher than your median home price. I mean, that's just the wage. You take another earner in that household, you've got enough money to earn much more than what would be the average single-family home. If you take that wage by itself, that wage can pay a rent much greater than your average rent right now. And so when we think about emerging industries in Fremont County, do you have the housing that is currently available to match that emerging industry? Because if you don't, that is an industry that's going to suffer from outmigration, because people are going to be looking at housing that fits their needs, and it might not be here in Fremont County.
Because, thank you. Where do the doctors and nurses part fit into this? Because I would think St. Thomas More and some of the auxiliary things would fit in here somewhere. And they'd be higher wage.
So they do have higher wages, and when we did our survey, that was one of the key things. Doctors, nurses, surgeons, all commuting into Canyon City.
Okay.
However, it's not a high wage. The rate of growth for those wages in that sector was not as high as these. The reason we're highlighting these sectors is because over the last couple years, these industry sectors have seen the highest wage potential from 2018, the highest growth. And so we wanted to isolate them. Some of them, you know, this goes back to the affordable housing argument. I mean, accommodation and food services, other services, wholesale trade, real estate, you know, these are key parts of your economy, but the wages are much lower. So that's, again, we're looking at a continuum, a spectrum. That's why affordable housing is going to continue to be a need here in Canyon City. But when we're talking about growth strategies, there's ways to start catalyzing growth that might help out the full spectrum. Anybody have a cat? Is there cats walking around in here? No, I'm just curious. All right. And so finally, the last thing we looked at economically, and this is a big one, is commuting patterns, right? So we have an inflow-outflow analysis from the U.S. Census, and you talk about people employed in the selection area, so this is Canyon City, employed and living. In Canyon City, only about 35% of the people who work here live here. 65% are commuting from outside Canyon City to work here.
You have to think about this too, that Lincoln Park is in the county, it's not in the city. So locally, there's a significant population locally, but it does show up pretty well in the county numbers that we still have significant number of people coming into the community.
And that's what this second chart is meant to capture, because obviously people might be living outside city limits, but they might just be outside city limits. I live just outside the city of Durango. But even if we look at the county, almost a third of the county that works in Fremont County commutes from outside. And so this is a key number. These are thousands of residents that could be located in Fremont County or Canyon City if there was a compelling reason to live here. Some of it has to do with affordability, no doubt, but many of these people that are commuting in are commuting from places that cost more to live than Fremont County. So we have to assume that there could be a reason that there's just not housing stock available for these individuals. And so speaking of housing stock, going back to the south.
Apologies. I'm not sure if you can see hands or not.
Oh, no, I
No.
can't. Go ahead, though. I can hear you.
Awesome. Andy, do you mind going back one slide? Thank you. I just want to make sure that I'm fully understanding this. So this chart shows that in 2021, we had 6,879 jobs located in Canyon City, Colorado. Is that correct?
Oh, am I on? Okay. No, it would be 6,879 employees that are in the selection area.
Okay. So people who are employed somewhere and well, can you just explain what the three lines mean then in a little bit more detail, and then also kind of whether they're tracking inflow, outflow, or both, and which one is which line? Thanks.
Sure thing. So employed in the selection area, basically it's taking the number of employees that are showing up in the Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers within Canyon City's municipal limits. And then the second line is the employed and living in the selection area. So of those employees that are listed in BLS's statistical data, how many live within the municipal limits? And then the third line is employed in the selection area, but they live outside. And so that's how it's adding up to 100%. It's doing that for first Canyon City and then Fremont County.
So to go back to Councilmember Schmischer's question, so there are 6,879 jobs within the city limits of Canyon City.
And
Yeah,
look,
that was the question. Is that correct?
well, it's a great, all right, so this, I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole here. It's a great question because if you go to the BLS data, Bureau of Labor Statistics, you'll get one number. If you go to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, you'll get another number. And if you go to the U.S. Census, you'll get another number. And the reason for that is they count employment differently. And I rely on the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I don't want to get into all the details, but say you're a sole proprietor, you're not going to show up in this data. And there's other examples like that that would be outside of it. What I will say is that when we're trying to follow commuting patterns, this is the best data that we have. And the most important number for me is the percentage of that workforce that is either in city limits or outside of it, or in Fremont County or outside of it.
And just a question
But
on that.
But, sorry, I am on have
Sure.
a follow-up question to this, if that's okay, John.
Sure.
Thanks. So what I'm trying to understand, though, is how that relates to the inflow and outflow analysis. Because if what this is looking at is those 6,879 jobs that are located within the municipal boundaries of Canyon City, how are we tracking those who are living here but working elsewhere? Or are we? Is it not actually an outflow analysis? Or is it an outflow in a different way? Thanks.
I see what you mean.
In other words, is this a net figure? Is that what you're asking?
No, that's
No.
not what I'm asking.
Okay.
Yeah, you're asking how many people total that live in Canyon City might be working outside of it?
Yes, I mean, this chart does not actually address the outflow. Is that correct?
Yes, that outflow number is not in that chart. I can get that number to you. I will say
great.
that the inflow number is much higher than the outflow
Okay.
number.
Okay, that would be super helpful, though. Thank you.
No problem.
And the kind of the follow-up question on this slide is that those are two independent data sets at one. We're not double counting people in these.
We're not double counting.
Thank you.
The purpose of these charts is simply to demonstrate, relative to the number of people employed in Canyon City and Fremont County, how many of those employees are coming from outside of those boundaries.
Sorry, just to ask John's question in a slightly different way. So there are 10,586 jobs in Fremont County outside of the Canyon City municipal boundaries.
I have to double check that. I believe it is. I believe that those are net of Canyon City's jobs. but I'll double check that for you.
Thank you.
So we're looking at 16,000, 17,000 basically total. Is that what we're,
I'll have to double check and get back to you on that. What I know is that when we went through this analysis, the key number for us was the third of employment that is commuting from outside of Fremont County. And that is a key number in terms of thinking about latent demand, because those are thousands of employees that could theoretically be living within Fremont County and by default living within Canyon City. But I apologize for the lack of clarity on these charts. I'll get back to you with those numbers.
Thank you. I think one of the reasons I'm particularly, and perhaps why John is particularly interested as well, is with the number of Bureau of Prisons and Colorado Department of Corrections facilities that are just outside the city limits, especially with the Colorado Department of Corrections. It would be, I think, really helpful to fully understand that distinction between Canyon City and Fremont County.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and it's not in these slides. We did talk to the Department of Corrections, and one of the things that we realized is that, and this goes into the latent demand analysis, they're expecting thousands of jobs in the next 5 to 10 years. They're going to be increasing their employment, and we had a discussion about where would those jobs be located, and is there reason to think that those jobs would be located in Canyon City? And they essentially said that it would follow certain commuting patterns that we've seen. And so we were anticipating about a third of those jobs, if the housing is available, could be located within Canyon City over the next 10 years. Is it okay if I go to, I know we're coming up, we have a hard stop at 6, so I want to keep moving unless there's more questions about the economics.
Nothing else from me, thanks.
Okay. So again, the frustrating pace of growth. You've seen this slide before. You've seen, again, this key number of Canyon City's annual building permits, which are far too low. I mean, let's just put it in perspective for a second. It is nearly impossible to build a multifamily apartment complex that's under 50 units. Like, it just doesn't really pencil, right, from a development standpoint. So if you in a single year only getting, since 2016, your max is 48 units, how could a multifamily developer look at that and say, I have a chance to build this in a year? Like, that's kind of the rub here, and that's what we're trying to overcome. And so when we talk about the local study area and housing rates, this is going back to this multifamily example, we wanted to see, well, how many people really rent? And what we see is, Williamsburg, Rockville, Florence, Brookside, all of the outside areas as well as Fremont County, the housing tenure, the percent of the population that's renting is far below the state average, right? So not a lot of rental options there. That makes sense. Canyon Cities is actually more in line with the state average as well as Florence. And so you would think, okay, well, they would probably be more in line with the state average of that type of housing stock. But that's not the case. If we look at 2022, the total occupied rental units were about 2,200 units, and multifamily only made up 30%. So what that's telling us is that there's a vast majority of renters renting single-family homes relative to the apartments. And even these multifamily apartment units, most of them are subsidized. Some of them have to deal with the corrections department and whatnot, but these are subsidized apartment units. So there's virtually no market rate apartments available. And so that represents a huge gap in the market that I think makes it would be very strategic on your part to invest in that, incentivize that. And the reason for that is there is this thing called churn. It's almost impossible to quantify, but if you have 2,000, let's just say it's 1,500 units, single-family homes that are currently being rented, and you introduce maybe nicer rental options in the market, those renters might move out of those single-family homes into those apartments. That's opening up, that's almost like double counting supply, right? You're introducing a unit and getting a unit at the same time. That's a way to boost your supply. Some of those houses might be very aged, dilapidated, maybe they need to turn over, that's fine. But either way, that churn can open up more housing for your community, and it also can boost affordability. The other thing that was fascinating is we look at your median age of housing stock. So for the state of Colorado, the median age of housing is 1986. So that's like kind of our benchmark, right? Now in the region, there's a lot of older housing. I mean, Fremont County's below it. Chaffey County's above it. You look at El Paso County, slightly above the median age. Pueblo County, certainly older housing stock. You'd probably expect that with Pueblo County. And Teller County right in line. But if you look at Canyon City, 1973. So it's the oldest housing stock when we really zero in on this regional study area. And the thing that was really shocking is if you look at the houses built 1939 or earlier, this gray bar represents Canyon City's percentage of the housing stock. So almost 25% of the city's housing stock was built in 1939 or earlier. That's a problem from a competitive standpoint because your housing stock is getting compared to all of these regional housing stocks, and that might be one of the reasons why it's hard to find good housing or housing that fits modern needs. Not putting anybody's house, maybe there's some beautiful historic houses out there. I'm not trying to put it down. But the fact of the matter is, it is a little bit behind the 8 ball.
And when I came to town and started to look at houses, the first thing I noticed was that this is a really old housing stock. I really couldn't find anything that was comparable, unless I went up to Dawson Ranch, and I couldn't afford that at the time. It really struck me as old housing stock.
And so what I wanted to do is create a statistic that would show development pace relative to Fremont County and the regional studied area. And really what this is representing is a ratio. It's a ratio of the number of building permits that were built between 2010 and 2022 relative to the existing population. Now that might sound a little confusing, but here's what you gotta know. It's hard to compare the rate of growth, say, in El Paso County when you have Colorado Springs, you have this existing population because that existing population builds momentum in terms of the development pace, right? We wanted to normalize that across the board relative to population. And what you see is that in Colorado, for every 123 residents, there's about 1 new building permit. That's like its pace. Teller County's close to that. Fremont County is second to last. And then here's a way to explain it just looking at these outliers. If we think about Pueblo County's pace, this is way off the charts, over 1,000 residents per new building permit. And that makes sense because Pueblo County has Pueblo, the city of Pueblo, that was a much larger city many, many years ago. Their housing stock was for a population that was much, much bigger when the steel mills were kicking. And I work with Pueblo all the time. They have a high vacancy rate. So as their population grows, there's a lot of existing housing stock that can absorb, and there's less of a need to build new. On the flip side of that, you look at Chaffey County. Chaffey County actually is building, they're not building like crazy, but the houses that they're building, people aren't living there. Those are second homes, right? So their population's staying static, but they're building. And so that's why you see that ratio getting closer to 0. The point here is that Fremont County is falling behind the development pace of the state. Again, highlighting what we already know. We need more housing. We need to build it more. We need to increase that supply. And so then finally, this is going back to the affordability. I understand if you look at Fremont County and you compare it to the regional area of 2015 to 2023, Fremont County had the highest % increase in housing price relative to its existing median single-family home price out of the region. So we understand the pinch, we understand the pain of affordable housing, but is it really that unaffordable? If we can compare to Colorado, Chaffey County, El Paso County, Pueblo County, Teller County, and you look at these median home values, only Pueblo County is lower. And then the thing that really jumps out compared to Fremont County is this rent per unit, $797 per unit. That is because most of these units are subsidized. It's also showing that a lot of the rental data is not showing up in the single family home market. And you look at these other rental, let's take El Paso County, $1,500, Teller County, $1,500, Chaffey County, $1,200 rent per unit. There's a big gap here, again, highlighting the fact that there's an opportunity in the market for multifamily development. And so really what The study found, analyzing the housing market, is that there's some target price points if you want to focus on a growth strategy. If we look at El Paso County, married couple household AMI, it equates to a house about $460,000 in price. Non-family, area median income for max monthly rent, about $1,300 a month. Same thing with Pueblo County. This is $375,000 married couple household. You can imagine that could be townhomes. And these are price points that I believe, looking at some development in the area, that could be achieved, especially through incentives. And so this would be that regional out-migration target price points that I believe that Canyon City, their economic development department, focusing your incentives in such a way to catalyze development around these price points, you can start to realize growth that is located in the latent demand analysis. And so finally, changing perceptions. I have to highlight this because it's a serious risk to your community in terms of growth. This is the State Demographer's Office projections for your county going out to 2050 as is. And what it means is that the State Demographer thinks that the annual average growth rate for Fremont County is going to be 0.15%. If you use that growth rate and you factor in all of the data analysis we just talked about, Canyon City's annual housing unit demand is 12 units per year. There's no way that you could ever develop if that's your annual housing unit demand. And so when we dug into this, we saw it's because the State Demographer over the next 5 years, and I'm not faulting the State Demographer, they're great, but they did a correction on net migration. They assumed that because of COVID, net migration was extremely high and that it was going to settle out and it was going to course correct, and then they projected it off from that point. What it means is that if net migration stops, this is what you're stuck with. If you're not attracting outside residents to Canyon City, to Fremont County, this growth is not going to be enough to generate housing development, and now you're kind of stuck. It's like the doldrums of housing development. When we adjust net migration, when we take your historic net migration numbers and we adjust it, that number jumps up to 60 units per year. Now we're not necessarily cooking, but at least we've got a chance to start attracting some housing development. And then when we finally factor in latent demand, which was calculated by talking to your primary employers, how they're going to hire over the next 10 years, looking at net migration patterns, looking at commuting patterns, and looking at if we were to provide the housing at those certain price points, how could that be incorporated? That's where we get back to what I talked about earlier, that 100-unit annual housing demand. At 100 units a year, you can build multifamily. You can attract single-family home developers, and most importantly, because I work with quite a bit of underwriters, you can get lending on those developments, and that's a key thing. If you can't finance it, you're not going to be able to see it. So finally, and I'm sorry that this is small, our key findings. And sorry about the CC. Maybe we can drag that down for a second and you can flip that back up when I get to 9. So if you take nothing away from this very long report, this is the thing that I would want you to think about in terms of strategies moving forward. Canyon City and Fremont County's growth is dependent on net migration. It has been over the last 10 years, and it looks like it's going to continue that way. Out-migration, especially among certain cohorts, is a threat to Canyon City and Fremont County's growth. Residents and workers are living in more expensive counties with more expensive housing prices and rental rates. That's that specific 40 to 59-year-old age cohort. New residential development needs to compete with these out-migration locations and retain residents at risk for relocating. We're going to highlight the professional, scientific, and technical services sector as an emerging industry in Fremont County, and you should align housing with that industry and that industry's needs. Commuters and existing industry growth represent latent demand for housing. And then the current housing stock, like we said, is very outdated. So trying to turn that over to create that churn. Regional housing is increasingly becoming more unaffordable. That was what that chart was demonstrating, that Fremont County, relative to its regional partners, still has a more affordable housing stock than your surrounding counties. And finally, new residential development could increase affordability. That gets that idea of churn, that idea of supply, bringing in new supply, focusing on rentals while simultaneously focusing on single-family home development would be able to open up existing single-family home stock and hopefully increase your whole spectrum of housing affordability. Thank you for your time, and I apologize I was coughing into this mic for the last 30 minutes.
I have a quick question. I may not have absorbed it all, which is entirely possible, but you talk a lot about single-family and apartment developments, but where do you see, because in my mind, the idea of townhome development is just like, there's got to be a market for a whole lot more of that if it's done right. And I just wondered where that fits into your analysis there.
So that's a great question, and I'm not avoiding townhomes. When I think of really what we're talking about is for sale, for rent. Those are the two things. And when we're talking about the townhomes, the reason that married couple household AMI at $375,000 as a max purchase price, and this is a little dated because it's going back to 2022. That's the most available data that we have for some of these wages and area median incomes. Pueblo County, that $375,000 mark, I'm seeing a lot of townhome or duplex development that could be new market development around that number. So like for $375,000, $400,000, that could be what, if you take that number, you think of a housing development type, that's exactly what we're talking about, a denser for sale product versus, you know, the El Paso County's $460,000, $470,000 single family home price. And then this really has to be factored into when we talk about multifamily development. If I'm an apartment complex out here, could I achieve $1,500, you know, a month rents for and have it be market rate? Possibly, you know.
Okay.
Any other questions? Good stuff. I appreciate that. Thank you,
Sorry,
Rick,
President, I
again.
keep on forgetting that you can't see my hand.
You can't-
Go ahead, sorry.
Oh.
No worries. You had mentioned that your report focused on incentives that we could use to catalyze this growth. Are those specific incentives outlined in the full report?
I talk about them, but no. More than happy to give you that full incentive list. It's actually a short conversation. The way I would describe it, if we're talking about market rate development, the incentives that you really have to focus on, you have with your Urban Renewal Authority in terms of tax increment financing. You would be able to partner up with private developers using tools such as a Metro District for public financing to fund infrastructure if it's needed. But I would highly recommend using your local incentives. Look, Rick said before, I work with DCI and I do urban renewal work all over the state. The reason I like tax increment financing is because you don't have to ask for permission to use it. It's a local autonomy incentive. You decide as your community whether or not you want to apply it to certain projects, and it can get projects over the hump. You're not asking the state for grants necessarily or the federal government for grants. And like Rick said earlier, you have a LIHTC project that doesn't receive the credits and all of a sudden it goes away. So that would be the main tool that I would focus on for attracting market rate development.
Sure.
And
I think it would just be super helpful to understand, like, what should we specifically be doing differently than we're currently doing in order to attract this new development. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Andy, Rick and I know, but can you give a disclosure about the work that you've done for 4 Mile?
Yeah, no problem. So it's not parallel with this project. I was asked by Rick and Ryan to evaluate some of the development proposals for 4 Mile Ranch and try to find a way to incentivize that development to make it work. What I was able to do is essentially look at their zoning plans, their PD, development pro formas, model it out over 25 years. If Canyon City were to use and leverage, to Amy's question, urban renewal authorities, tax increment financing, metro districts, all these public financing tools to make that development happen. And we ran into the same issue that we're talking about right now, the absorption rate. When we talked to D.A. Davidson, that was the bank, and I presented my feasibility analysis to them, they were saying, well, we just need to see some housing development that exceeds what you've currently built over the last 5 years. We need to see those numbers get exceeded before we're able to issue bonds to pay for this infrastructure because it was considered too risky. And so it's, again, you really need to, the point of this report is that demand does exist. Look, I'm not here to give a sermon, but this is like kind of a statement of faith that this community has to say, we believe the demand is there and we have to demonstrate it. And so the best way to demonstrate that demand, in my opinion, is by entering in a public-private partnership with very strategic developments that you know are going to be able to exceed that 30, 35 unit a year count. Because if you can break out of that, then all of a sudden there's proof of concept. And so that was some of the work that we did with 4 Mile. Ryan, thanks for asking about it.
Did you want to conclude, or John, did you have something quick?
No.
No? Well, your name came up here, sorry.
Oh, no, that's it.
So we
I think it
can.
was static.
You're static? No. Thank you. That's very interesting. And I'm in that industry, and I know the things you said are absolutely true. That we run up against the financing and the cost of infrastructure, and it's horrendous. And I think your suggestion is well taken, that it should be that relationship with government and with the private sector to get that going. I've experienced that in another state where I developed, and it worked very well. So we need to really hone in on that and talk about it.
Yeah, and Ryan and I went to and Andy was there at the time, actually, a TIF summit a couple of years ago in Pueblo, and the primary topic in that summit was building housing with tax increment financing, and all the while we're like, you don't generate enough property tax in residential to use TIF. You know, how can you do it? But there's been a lot more talk about tax increment financing in residential. I mean, they're generating TIF, just not as much as commercial.
Well, what they talked about, and I don't want to go too long on it, it was a whole
That's a
bundle
different
of
rabbit
things
hole. Yeah.
that occurred because those households bought water, paid sewer for, in this particular town, new water system, and bought stuff in town, which was retail sales, so tax. So it was all part of that bundle that created on an
Yeah.
area that was vacant in a 200-lot subdivision, and that was their, because I left here doing subdivisions and went there, and I couldn't believe that they actually were going to do that sort of stuff, but that was what was going on. It was incremental financing. It was a fact. And I was told that those people that live under those roofs are going to buy stuff in our town, and they're going to buy water from us and pay for our sewer system. So, okay, great. Shall we conclude?
So, Mr. Mayor, I have a motion.
Oh,
Go forward.
I'm sorry,
no.
we're
Yeah.
gonna have to close this meeting and then open the special meeting.
Oh, okay.
If Andrea and Amy can stay on this Zoom until we make the motion to adjourn to the executive session, and then we'll close this Zoom and start that one.
So we are then adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you for your time,
Thanks,
everyone.
really appreciate the information.
And we open the new session.
Yep.
And with the motion,
Yeah,
we're
you-
now in a new session, and the motion is in order. Is that correct?
We need to do a roll call for the new
Roll
session
call,
real quick.
okay.
Councilmember Dennehy,
Here.
Councilmember Maloney,
Here.
Councilmember Schmischer,
Here.
Councilmember Stein,
Here.
Councilmember Tracy,
Here?
Councilmember Worthington,
Here?
Mayor Pro Tem Hamrick,
Here.
Mayor Troutman.
Here.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, Mr. Hamrick.
I move that the city council enter into executive sessions for the following purposes. Executive session to determine positions relative to matters that may be subject to negotiations, develop a strategy for negotiations, and to instruct negotiators pursuant to CRS 24-6-4024E concerning the future and next steps for the community pool project by the Canyon City Metropolitan Recreation and Park District in terms of a potential intergovernmental agreement between the city and the Recreation District for the distribution of the city's sales tax, and to seek legal advice on specific legal issues regarding the city's legal strategy in addressing the application filed by Black Hills in PUC proceeding number 24 AL-0275E pursuant to CRS 24-6-4024B.
Second.
Motion's made in second. Any questions on that motion? Would you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Dennehy?
Aye.
Councilmember Maloney?
Aye.
Councilmember Schmisher?
Aye.
Councilmember Stein?
Aye.
Councilmember Tracy?
Aye.
Councilmember Worthington?
Aye.
And Mayor Pro Tem Hamrick.
Aye.
Okay, shall we adjourn to
We shall
executive
adjourn.
session?
Thank you.